spend the rest of these lectures giving an overview of principal objections to the messiahship of Jesus Yeshua based on the New Testament and then based on traditional Judaism. Now, I have over 600 pages of material in this, roughly, in volumes 4 and 5 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. And if you want to get the full depth, just like for any of the subjects we covered, dive into the books, you get the information there. But we're going to tackle the principal, the most important ones, the largest ones, but we'll try to do it more concisely, and then you can dig more deeply in your further studies in Volume 4 and Volume 5. Jewish objections to the New Testament can be broken down into several categories. The New Testament misquotes and misinterprets the Hebrew Scriptures, at times manufacturing verses to suit its purposes. The genealogies of Jesus given by Matthew and Luke are hopelessly contradictory at best and entirely irrelevant anyway. The New Testament is filled with historical and factual errors, especially Stephen's speech. The teachings of Jesus are impossible, dangerous, and un-Jewish, and Jesus as a person was not so great either. The New Testament is even self-contradictory, if you want to put it bluntly. Only a fool would believe in the divine inspiration of the New Testament. So let's start with this accusation that the New Testament misquotes and misinterprets the Old Testament. At times it manufactures verses to suit its purposes. Here's the answer. No truth whatsoever to this claim. First, remember that the New Testament authors were Jews, with the probable exception of Luke, and they were sometimes writing to Jewish readers who knew their scriptures well. So to manufacture, misquote, or misinterpret verses from the Tanakh would be absolutely self-defeating. You see, they didn't just, in 30 seconds, just write down Gospel of Matthew, write down. No. This was the process, the project of years of work and compilation and meditation and checking sources and putting things together. So it's not just, hey, let's just trick everybody. Plus, they wanted people to study. They wanted people to dig. They wanted people to go further. So to manufacture a verse or to rip it completely out of context, it wouldn't take long for someone to figure out. So, yeah, well, we did figure it out. That's why we rejected it. Well, that's a little bit of a superficial approach for obvious reasons. The fact is, these authors spent much time meditating on the Tanakh. And you'd be amazed to see just how insightful their quotations and interpretations are, not to mention how much they're in keeping with the ancient Jewish methods of scriptural hermeneutics. Now, just some stats for you, all right? The New Testament is roughly 8,000 verses. Some scholars claim that almost 1 in 3, about 2,500 out of 8,000, contain an Old Testament quote or a general allusion. And you can show solidly that more than 10% of the New Testament text is made up of citation or direct allusions to the Old Testament. You can show solidly more than 10%, a direct quotation, citing the Hebrew Scriptures to make a point, more than 10%. The book of Revelation contains 404 verses. As many as 331 of those verses are drawn from the imagery of the Hebrew Scriptures. It only quotes one verse directly, that's from Psalm 2. And yet, over 300 verses, perhaps as many as 331 out of 404, are taken from imagery of the Hebrew Scriptures. I just want you to understand how deeply enmeshed this is. A New Testament and Judaic literature scholar Craig Evans summarized the situation well. The theology of the New Testament is fundamentally indebted to and a reflection of major Old Testament themes, images, and languages. There is simply no significant element in New Testament theology that is not in some way a development of a tradition or theology expressed in the sacred writings that eventually came to be what Christians call the Old Testament, Jews call the Tanakh, and scholars call the Hebrew Bible. In other words, this is a simple continuation of here's what the Hebrew Scripture said. Now they continue their development in this revelation of Jesus Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, and bring this message not only to the Jews but to the nations as well. And as I said in the previous lecture, some scholars have analyzed, Robert H. Gundry being the best known one who wrote a particular study on this, but scholars have analyzed. Let's see how Matthew cites and uses the Hebrew Scriptures. Now let's see how the Talmudic writings do, the principal rabbinic writings, midrashic writings, others, Talmud in particular. And now let's see how the Jewish authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls quoted from the Hebrew Scriptures. And what they found was that the one who quoted in the best context and who seemed to have the best interpretive grasp of the meaning of the verses in context was Matthew, who was the least prone to just pull them out of context and out of meaning. Professor Joseph Fitzmyer, authority in the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Jewish literature, also a New Testament scholar, he said no less than the Qumran authors, Dead Sea Scroll authors, the New Testament writers considered their history to be guided by the hand of God, but for the New Testament authors, his words spoken through the prophets and writers of the Old Testament had already seen fulfillment in the new events and situations of the early Christian history. Due to the predominantly backward glance of the New Testament writers, which we have already noted, the number of such modernized texts in the New Testament is considerably greater. In other words, looking back and saying, oh, this happened to Israel, now it's fulfilled here in the Messiah, it's finding many, many, many such references. Again, I get into great detail in this in Volume 4. Now here's what's fascinating. If you look through Talmudic tractates that make ample reference to the Hebrew Scriptures, some refer to the Hebrew Scriptures more than others, some quote Tanakh more than others. If you look at the ones that quote from Tanakh the most, you'll see that sometimes it's a literal quotation. This is what the verse meant in context. This is how it's being used by the rabbinic writers. Sometimes you'll find it's used homiletically, just a point or a play on words, or even mnemonically to help you remember certain things by a certain particular text. Sometimes it's completely wrenched out of its context and quoted in a way that it's an impossible meaning. It can't possibly mean that. These are all the different ways that verses are quoted. The New Testament uses several of those ways, but it never takes a verse in such a way that's impossible to the original context. Sometimes it's literal. Hey, this is what the prophet said. Look, it's how it's coming to pass. Sometimes it's homiletical. It's a play on words. Sometimes it's there to kind of beautify the text, to bring a poetic illusion. This would have been very much in keeping with Jewish interpretation at the time of Yeshua and in the centuries that followed. So in other words, read the New Testament as a Jewish book, and a lot of the so-called problems go away. And those things that are meant to be literal fulfillment, take as literal fulfillment. And those things that are meant to be midrashic or homiletic, take as midrashic and homiletic. I hope you're following me here. Orthodox Jewish journalist and author David Klinghoffer said this about Matthew and how Matthew quotes from the Hebrew Scriptures. He said, pointing out the imprecision of proof texts like these, one feels almost unsporting. It's too easy. Yet it is with these that the New Testament begins its first attempt at narration of the life of the Christian Messiah. Whoever the first educated Jews were to have these prophetic verses cited to them, whether in Jesus' lifetime or later, they could have reacted only with puzzlement and disbelief. As the song says, is that all there is? Matthew, you gotta be kidding me. These are your proofs? This is your big book? This is the good news? We're supposed to believe in Jesus because you wrote this? Are you kidding me? Now here's something interesting. W.D. Davies collaborated with Dale C. Allison, two prominent New Testament scholars and scholars of early Jewish literature. They wrote together a 3-volume series, Dale Allison doing the bulk of the work ultimately, 3-volume series on Matthew in the International Critical Commentary. You want to talk about detailed, you want to assume that in reading it you understand Greek, you understand Latin, you understand Hebrew, you understand Aramaic, you understand German, you understand French. I mean, it's detailed, it's scholarly, it's expecting its readers to be academic. These men spent decades poring through the text of Matthew, poring through the commentaries, poring through the related literature, pouring into the text in its original Greek, writing a commentary of several thousand pages on Matthew. Look at what they said. David Klinghoffer said, yeah, I mean, the way Matthew quotes things, yikes, shooting fish in a barrel, of course that's wrong, not what it means, misinterpretation, misquote. I almost feel unsporting showing how wrong it is. Listen to what Davies and Allison said, having devoted decades to the intensive academic study of Matthew. Matthew was not above scattering items in his Greek text whose deeper meaning could only be appreciated by those with a knowledge of Hebrew. Indeed, it might even be that Matthew found authorial delight in hiding bonus points for those willing and able to look a little beneath the gospel's surface. Did you get that? Did you follow that? They're saying that Matthew enjoyed making things so rich that if you really understood Hebrew and could see what he was doing, quoting the Hebrew scriptures and putting them in Greek a certain way, like, oh, that's what he meant. And maybe even that he hid things to see if you dig deep enough, you'll come up with the answer. You know what it reminds me of? I often use this illustration. Let's say some student comes up to you, you're teaching physics, some student comes up to you and says, Professor, I've made a discovery that's going to change the face of science in this century. I've made perhaps the most revolutionary discovery of all time. And I'd like to share that with you. Professor says, oh, you have? Really? Great. Let's hear it. E equals mc squared. That's your brilliant discovery. Yeah. E equals mc squared. Now, someone who doesn't understand physics, the theory of relativity, the whole bit, would hear that and say, what? Oh, yeah, one of the greatest scientific discoveries in the history of mankind, something that's going to change the entire century and change the face of science and so on and so forth. E equals mc squared. Oh, yeah, right, sure. Brilliant. But in point of fact, it was brilliant. In point of fact, it was revolutionary. As simple as it is, for those who understand it, profound. Well, these authors are saying that what Matthew says, it may look simple, and you may think there's nothing to it, and you may do what David Klinghoffer does, says, Matthew, come on, you can do better than that. They said, no, dig deeper. It's more profound than that. Dig deeper, and you will discover. So let me give you an example of an alleged manufacturing of a verse by Matthew, okay? An alleged manufacturing of a verse. Matthew chapter 2. End of Matthew chapter 2 says something very, very interesting. Here we go. We'll start in verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life were dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judah in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. And there I've got in quotes in my Bible, he shall be called a Nazarene. That's what the prophet spoke. There's only one problem. There's no such prophecy. Prophets never said that. Matthew made it up. Okay. First, for what purpose? If he's trying to help Jewish followers of Jesus grow in their faith and be strengthened in the faith, and if he's trying to reach Jewish people in his community that don't believe in Yeshua, what's the purpose of manufacturing something that everybody knows was manufactured? Well, you see, a lot of people didn't have Bibles then, and a lot of people couldn't check. Yeah, but there are others who had the text basically memorized. Because things were passed on orally and there was so much study that was done, you don't manufacture a verse to here, I'm in a court of law, and I'm arguing for my client. And I say, if you will look in the statute of 1956, the court and the ruling of this versus this, they said, and I make the thing up. Well, someone's going to say, well, where is that? That's a great point you made, but where is it? And he didn't have to say anything. In other words, he just could have said he came to Nazareth. End of subject. Not everything has to be a prophecy. Not everything has to be foretold in advance. So just leave it. Don't make something up that doesn't exist. So the idea that he would make something up is so outlandish, so self-defeating, so illogical that we need to say, okay, what's he actually saying? Now, we're going to step back. And we're going to work our way through these early chapters of Matthew, all right? We see first, he presents this as the book of the genealogy of Yeshua the Messiah. the son of David, the son of Abraham, and he goes from there. We'll look more at the genealogy later, but he divides it into 3 14s, in one counting two different ways. He divides it into 3 groups of 14, perhaps because David in Hebrew, David, Dalet Vav Dalet, equals 14. 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals 14. So his name, perhaps symbolizing 14, son of David, Messiah. Could be. Or it could just be it was divided like that to help people memorize 14, 14, 14. Then he quotes from Isaiah chapter 7. The miraculous birth of Yeshua fulfills what Isaiah prophesied, that just a young maiden will have this glorious birth, apparently birth of supernatural import. Her child will be called Emmanuel. We looked at that in some depth earlier and saw that Matthew is looking at Isaiah 7, 9, and 11, which we'll come back to. We'll see why I say that. He's looking at 7, 9, and 11 at this larger context and realize this is a prophecy to godless Ahaz, to the house of David. It's a prophecy about a king that's going to be born. Therefore, whatever happened in that day is just a foreshadowing of a greater fulfillment of a messianic king. That's all he's saying. And by the way, this is the only time this verse is quoted in the New Testament. People say it's the central prophecy. It's just quote it one time. And it's based on seeing a fuller meaning in Isaiah 7 through 11. Then Messiah's birth prophesied in Micah, the 5th chapter. This is where David came from, his origins in Bethlehem, so also the Messiah. Either saying his origins go all the way back to that or saying they're pre-existent. And we know that rabbinic interpretation says that the Messiah is pre-existent or his name is pre-existent. So that would be in keeping with some rabbinic thought. Matthew quotes Micah 5, you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, by no means least among the rulers of Judah. The Hebrew says you are the least, but nonetheless from you, the ruler will come. Either Matthew is understanding the Hebrew lamed as low, not, so you're not the least, or he's simply, in a Targumic paraphrastic interpretation, saying it says you're the least, but actually you're not because the Messiah comes through. But he's quoting here, alluding to Micah chapter 5. Now, Yeshua goes into Egypt. Before that, goes into Egypt as God's son, so that what the prophet said can be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. So just as Israel in its infancy went into Egypt, we looked at this earlier, Hosea 11:1. Matthew wants to see the whole verse, not just the snippet he quotes, but the whole verse. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. So it goes back to Israel's history. It's now recapitulated in the Messiah, who goes into Egypt as a child, God's son, just like Israel was, and then is called up out of Egypt. Then, as there's the slaughter of the baby boys in Bethlehem, Jeremiah hears Rachel weeping again from Jeremiah. Matthew hears Rachel weeping again from Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping a loud lamentation. Rachel, weeping for her children, refused to be comforted because they are no more. Well, Jeremiah heard her weeping poetically. Now Matthew does as well. This is, once again her voice is raised. These words are fulfilled. Once again she weeps and cries. She's in fact wept and cried many times for her children. It was talking initially about going into exile, and it says in Jeremiah, your children will return home. Here he's just hearing poetically. This is a midrashic interpretation. And then we have, he shall be called a Nazarene. When we move on from here, we see that John the Immerser is the forerunner of the Lord. There is a new exodus, Isaiah 40, a new and greater exodus, the deliverance of the captives, the exiles. And Yeshua comes according to Matthew, the 4th chapter, his coming and shining light in these places in Galilee. Now, that's what Isaiah spoke of. So we see the end of Isaiah 8, beginning of Isaiah 9. Matthew's looking at that. The land of Zebulun. We're in Matthew 4, the land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. So as Isaiah spoke then of his day, now we see its fulfillment through Yeshua. We also see that Yeshua is baptized at the Jordan. The children of Israel, of course, passed through. They passed through the Red Sea, then they crossed the Jordan. We see that Yeshua was tempted for 40 days in the wilderness, just as the children of Israel were tempted and tested for 40 years. He's 40 days in the wilderness. They're 40 years in the wilderness. He combats Satan, how? With 3 quotations from the book of Deuteronomy, the Wilderness Wanderings book. He combats Satan in the wilderness with 3 quotations from Deuteronomy. And then Matthew 5, he sees the crowds. What does he do? He goes up on the mountain, think Mount Sinai. Now he teaches Torah. The word of the Lord, the Torah of the Lord coming from Mount Sinai. So Matthew's looking at this as just very, very much messianic, very much all pointing towards King Messiah. Messiah Yeshua recapitulates what Israel did and now brings it to its full meaning. So what do we do with Matthew 2:23? And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that was spoken, what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. The first thing is Matthew uses a different term here than anywhere else. The way he puts it in Greek is different, and it's what was spoken by the prophets, plural. So this is not just a quote from one. This is what the prophets, plural, said. He shall be called a Nazarene. Nazarene, he lives in Nazareth. What's he talking about? Well, there's several things. First, Isaiah chapter 11, and there are many, many Jewish scholars believe this and hold to this is what was in Matthew's mind. And you'll see it's not just this one passage. Look at this. Isaiah 11:1. V'yatzah choter migeza Yishai. A shoot will come forth from the stock of Jesse. V'netzer mishorashav Yifreh. And a branch will spring from its roots. Netzer, the Messiah. This is a clear messianic prophecy. Rabbis, counter-missionaries agree on that. Isaiah 11, a netzer, he'll be a netzer. And he lives in Netzaret. He lives in Nazareth. Oh, isn't that interesting? And he's called the netzer. But hang on. Matthew says the prophets said this. Well, what's interesting is that his lowliness is spoken of, which would also tie in a place like Nazareth. But the prophets also called him Jeremiah 23, and then Zechariah 3, Zechariah 6. They used another name for netzer, branch, tzemach. Could it be that Isaiah, Jeremiah, all prophesying about the same one, the netzer, tzemach, the branch, this branch that springs forth from the root of Jesse, this messianic king? Could it be that Matthew is looking at these passages and it's prophesied that he's going to be called a netzer, he's going to be called a branch? So the prophets spoke this, and Isaiah in particular used the word netzer, which is then a play on words of the name Nazareth, Natzrat or Natseret. That would be one of those things that Davies and Allison were talking about, saying, see, Matthew's saying, dig a little deeper, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. And in fact, the prophets did call him the branch, which does speak of lowliness. And the prophets did refer to him, here Isaiah, as not just tzemach, but netzer. And here he lives in the city of Nazareth, and Matthew looks almost with a smile and a wink and says, that's what the prophets spoke. You see, if you're going to look at this as, well, scientific, it says this, and here, that's not how it's being used for the most part. This is understood as God's holy word, proclaiming these things often in mysteries. And now these mysteries are being opened up for us. That's why the psalmist prays in Psalm 119, Gal einai ve'abita niflaot mitortecha. Uncover my eyes, open my eyes, that I might behold wonders from your law. That rabbinic interpretation says that each verse of Torah is 70 different understandings and interpretations. We don't have to get into all that to believe that this word is very rich, and Matthew's unfolding it, having seen the Messiah, having watched his miracles, having seen him die, having seen him rise, having seen him ascend to heaven, and continue his miracles through him. Now he's looking back at the scriptures and says, look at this. This is amazing. It opens up for us. All right, we're going to continue looking at some of the principal Jewish objections to the Messiahship of Jesus Yeshua based on the New Testament. But I wanted to look at a few of these things in more depth to give you an understanding of how we refute these objections. And it's often in a very Jewish way that we refute the Jewish objection. Thanks so much for watching the broadcast. One of our viewers recently communicated to me, there's nothing more important that you can be doing. And you know, we hear from Jewish people through our materials, they've come to faith in Jesus Yeshua. Others had fallen away and they've come back to the Lord. Christians tell us they're now equipped to reach Jewish people with the gospel. And we have amazing open doors before us to reach more and more Jewish people than ever before, but we need your help. Everything we do is a team effort. Would you join together with us and become part of our team? Go to my website right now, askdrbrown.org, askdrbrown.org. Click on the support banner, the TV support banner, and join us. And for your gift of any size, I want to send you this book. I'm going to sign it for you. It's an exclusive hardcover edition of my book, The Real Kosher Jesus, which was written and published in a miraculous 10 weeks' time. I'll send it to you for your gift of any size. Go to askdrbrown.org, click on the TV support banner, become a monthly supporter, help us with a one-time gift, and friend, be assured that together we're making a difference in the salvation of Israel.
Please visit our website or call and ask how you can receive access to our countless free resources. Learn exciting information on what is happening around the world and with our ministry today. When you visit our website, be sure to check out our bookstore for the latest videos, books, and more. You may want to join us during an upcoming radio broadcast. Please contact us today for more information. Please remember, this ministry depends on tax-deductible donations from viewers like you.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Answering Your Toughest Questions. We are in the midst of our series on answering Jewish objections to Jesus. And these weeks, we have focused on some of those tough New Testament objections. Even followers of Jesus, committed followers of Jesus, read some of these texts and they wonder, boy, did the New Testament writers rightly understand what was being said by the Jewish writers of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures? And I don't understand how some of these things work. Well, that's what we're unfolding every week right here during our series on answering Jewish objections to Jesus. So tune in to next week's episode as we continue answering New Testament objections to the faith. And we invite all of you, if you're Jewish watching this broadcast, write to us at askdrbrown.org. Let us help you grow in your faith. And all of you, be sure to tune in next week as we continue on answering your toughest questions.
This has been a paid program made possible by financial contributions to Ask Dr. Brown Ministries from viewers like you in your area. Thank you for your support.